My daughter Jessica said I was too loud, too embarrassing, and too much of a social liability. So she started pretending I didn't exist in public, avoiding me at family events, and acting like she was ashamed to call me her mother. But I wasn't loud. I wasn't embarrassing. While she thought I'd quietly fade into the background of her perfect image, I was already planning to show her what life looked like when I truly didn't exist. This is how I taught the daughter who pretended I wasn't there what it meant to actually lose me, and how I made sure she understood the difference between being ignored and being completely erased from someone's world. I raised Jessica as a single mother after her father abandoned us when she was 5. He left one morning for work and never came home, leaving behind only debt and a broken little girl who kept asking when Daddy would return. I worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat: mornings at a diner, afternoons cleaning houses, evenings at a grocery store. Jessica never knew about the nights I fell asleep standing up or the meals I skipped so she could eat. When Jessica wanted dance lessons, I took on weekend catering jobs to afford them. When she needed a dress for prom, I sold my grandmother's wedding ring to buy it. When she got into college, I took out loans that I'm still paying today, working extra shifts until my hands bled from scrubbing floors. I never complained, never made her feel guilty. I just wanted her to have everything I never had. After graduation, Jessica got a job at a marketing firm in the city and transformed herself into someone I barely recognized. Gone were the simple clothes and grateful smiles. She started wearing expensive suits, speaking differently, acting like she'd been born into privilege instead of raised by a woman who counted pennies for grocery money. The changes were subtle at first. She'd correct my grammar during phone calls, suggesting I say isn't instead of ain't. She'd wince when I got excited and talked loudly in restaurants. When I wore my favorite bright red lipstick to her office Christmas party, she whispered, "Mom, maybe tone it down a little. This is a professional environment." I thought she was just helping me fit into her new world. I didn't realize she was trying to erase where she came from. When her coworkers asked about her family, she'd mention growing up modestly, but never talked about the 3 jobs, the food stamps, or the woman who worked herself to the bone so Jessica could become the polished professional she was today. The distance grew wider when Jessica started dating Marcus, a lawyer whose family had money going back generations. The first real betrayal came at Jessica's company picnic. I'd been looking forward to meeting her colleagues, wearing my best sundress and bringing my famous potato salad that everyone in our old neighborhood loved. But when I found Jessica by the volleyball net and went to hug her, she stiffened and whispered, "Mom, please don't make a scene." I hadn't made a scene. I'd simply walked over to my daughter and said hello. But she acted like I'd started stripping in public. When her boss came over to meet me, Jessica introduced me as Helen, not my mother Helen or my mom, just Helen, like I was some distant acquaintance she'd been forced to invite. During lunch, I sat with Jessica and her work friends, trying to contribute to conversations about their projects and clients. Every time I spoke, I saw Jessica's face tighten with embarrassment. When I laughed at someone's joke, maybe a little louder than the others because I was nervous and excited to be included, Jessica shot me a look that could have frozen fire. Later, as we walked to the parking lot, Jessica exploded. "Mom, you were so embarrassing today. The way you laughed, the way you talked about our old neighborhood, the way you kept trying to insert yourself into conversations. Everyone could tell you don't belong in that environment." Her words hit like physical blows. I thought I was being friendly and engaging. She'd seen it as humiliation. The next betrayal came at Marcus's family barbecue. Jessica had spent weeks preparing me for this event, like I was studying for a final exam. Don't talk about work unless someone asks directly. Don't mention how much things cost. Don't tell stories about when I was little. Just smile, be pleasant, and try to blend in. The message was clear: be invisible. I followed her rules perfectly, speaking only when spoken to, keeping my voice low, staying in the background. But it wasn't enough. When Marcus's mother complimented my homemade apple pie, I mentioned that the recipe had been passed down from my grandmother. Jessica immediately jumped in, steering the conversation away from my family history like it was something shameful. The pattern continued over the next year. Jessica would invite me to events, then spend the entire time managing my behavior, correcting my mistakes and apologizing for my existence. At her company Christmas party, she asked me to dress more conservatively because some of her colleagues would be there. The dress I'd planned to wear was perfectly appropriate, but Jessica wanted me in something less noticeable. The breaking point came at Jessica's engagement party, held at Marcus's parents' country club. I'd bought a new dress for the occasion, nothing fancy, just a simple navy blue dress that I thought was elegant and appropriate. I'd even gone to a salon to have my hair done, wanting to look my best for my daughter's special day. When I arrived at the country club, Jessica was greeting guests at the entrance with Marcus and his parents. I waited in line behind other well-dressed couples, excited to congratulate my daughter on her engagement. When my turn came, I stepped forward with a huge smile and open arms, ready to embrace the woman I'd raised and loved unconditionally for 28 years. Jessica's face went white when she saw me approaching. Instead of welcoming me warmly, she glanced around nervously, checking to see who might be watching. When I reached for a hug, she gave me a brief, stiff embrace and immediately stepped back. "Mom," she said quietly, "thank you for coming. Thank you for coming." Like I was a casual acquaintance who'd done her a favor by showing up to her engagement party. Not like I was the mother who'd sacrificed everything so she could be standing in this fancy country club, wearing a designer dress, engaged to a man whose family owned multiple homes. When Marcus's mother asked Jessica to introduce me, something devastating happened. Jessica hesitated, actually hesitated, as if she couldn't decide whether to acknowledge our relationship. Finally, she said, "This is Helen," pausing before reluctantly adding, "my mother." The way she said it, with such obvious reluctance and embarrassment, felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Throughout the evening, Jessica's behavior became more and more painful to watch. She'd position herself across the room from me, surrounding herself with Marcus's family and her work friends. When I tried to join conversations, she'd find ways to redirect attention away from me or suggest I might want to check out the dessert table or get some fresh air on the patio. The most humiliating moment came when Jessica was giving her engagement speech. She thanked Marcus for his love and support, thanked his parents for welcoming her into their family, thanked her colleagues for their friendship, and thanked Marcus's sister for helping plan the party. She thanked seemingly everyone who'd contributed to her happiness and success. Everyone except me. That's when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. Jessica was talking to Marcus's sister and a few other young women, and I heard one of them say, "Your mom seems sweet. Where did she grow up?" Jessica's response hit me like a physical blow. "Oh, she's not really. I mean, we don't have much in common anymore. She's very different from us. I try to include her in things, but honestly, it's sometimes easier when she's not around. It's sometimes easier when she's not around." My daughter had just told strangers that her life was easier without me in it. I left the party without saying goodbye, and that night I decided to give her exactly what she'd asked for. The morning after Jessica's engagement party, I began planning my disappearance with the same methodical approach I'd used to work 3 jobs while raising her alone. This wasn't going to be emotional or impulsive. It was going to be strategic, complete, and irreversible. First, I needed to understand exactly what role I still played in Jessica's life beyond being her source of embarrassment. I made a list of everything I did for her. I was listed as her emergency contact at work and with her doctors. I had a key to her apartment and watered her plants when she traveled. I was the beneficiary on her life insurance policy and the person she called when she needed someone to pick her up from medical procedures. More importantly, I was the person who remembered her childhood, who had photos and stories from before she reinvented herself. I was the living proof of where she came from, the witness to her humble beginnings that she was working so hard to erase. I realized that my disappearance would mean more than just losing a mother. It would mean losing her entire history, her origin story, the foundation that had made everything else possible. I started by changing all my contact information. I got a new phone number, a new address by moving to a small apartment across town, and I made sure none of these changes were forwarded to Jessica. When people asked why I was moving, I simply said I wanted a fresh start. I didn't tell anyone I was cutting ties with my daughter. That would have invited questions and intervention. Next, I removed myself from every aspect of Jessica's practical life. I sent her apartment key back in the mail with a note saying I no longer felt comfortable being responsible for her plants and mail when she traveled. I contacted her employer's human resources department and requested that my name be removed as her emergency contact, citing personal reasons. I did the same with her doctor's office, her insurance company, and anywhere else my name appeared as her backup person. I also began systematically destroying evidence of our relationship in her childhood. I threw away boxes of photos showing Jessica growing up in our tiny apartment, pictures of birthday parties where I'd made cakes from scratch because we couldn't afford bakery ones, images of Christmas mornings where we'd open presents under a tree I'd decorated with homemade ornaments. The hardest part was rewriting my own identity. For 28 years I'd been Jessica's mom first and Helen's second. Now I had to figure out who I was when that wasn't my primary identity anymore. Within 3 months, I'd transformed from someone whose entire identity revolved around being Jessica's mother to someone who existed independently, with my own goals, my own friendships, my own sources of fulfillment. The plan was simple: complete disappearance. No drama, no confrontation, no explanation. Jessica would simply wake up one day and discover that the mother she'd been so eager to hide had vanished entirely from her life. My plan went into motion during the spring when Jessica would normally start ramping up wedding planning activities. She'd been engaged for 4 months, and I knew she'd soon expect me to be involved in dress shopping, venue visits, and all the traditional mother-daughter wedding activities that she'd probably approach with her usual mixture of obligation and embarrassment. Instead of waiting for those awkward invitations where she'd reluctantly include me while hoping I wouldn't embarrass her in front of vendors and wedding professionals, I simply made myself unavailable. When she called my old number, she got a disconnected message. When she drove by my old apartment, she found new tenants. When she asked our former neighbors about me, they honestly told her they didn't know where I'd gone. I monitored her initial reaction through mutual acquaintances without her knowing. According to Mrs. Patterson from our old building, Jessica had seemed more annoyed than worried when she first discovered I'd moved without telling her. She kept saying it was just like her mother to make everything about herself, even during wedding planning. Mrs. Patterson told me when I called to check on how Jessica was handling my disappearance. This reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Jessica's first instinct was to assume I was being dramatic or attention-seeking rather than responding logically to years of being treated like an embarrassment. She trained herself to see everything I did through the lens of how it affected her image and convenience. The reality of my absence began to hit her when she tried to handle wedding planning details that she'd unconsciously expected me to manage. I'd always been the one who remembered family traditions, who knew which relatives should be invited, who had contact information for distant family members. Without me, she discovered that she had no connection to her own extended family history. The wedding dress shopping experience became a particular source of distress for Jessica. She'd planned to go with Marcus's sister and mother, deliberately excluding me from what should have been a mother-daughter experience. But when she was trying on dresses, she realized she had no one there who'd known her as a child, no one who could remember her dreams about her wedding day, no one who could provide the emotional continuity that mothers typically bring to such moments. The absence became more pronounced when Jessica tried to plan other wedding details that required family history and traditions. She had no idea what songs her father had liked, what flowers had been in her parents' wedding, what traditions our family typically observed at celebrations. She'd spent so many years distancing herself from her background that she'd lost connection to her own story. The wedding planning stress began affecting her relationship with Marcus and his family. Without me to serve as a buffer and source of family information, Jessica had to rely entirely on Marcus's family for guidance about traditions, etiquette, and planning details. This made her feel even more like an outsider marrying into their established family rather than bringing her own family legacy to unite with theirs. By summer, Jessica's desperation had escalated to hiring a private investigator to find me. But I'd been careful about covering my tracks, and the investigator could only confirm that I'd moved out of state and changed my name slightly on official documents. Jessica was learning what it truly meant for someone to disappear from your life completely, not just physically absent but deliberately unreachable. The complete devastation of Jessica's carefully constructed new life began in earnest during the final months before her wedding. What had started as minor inconveniences from my absence had snowballed into a cascade of problems that threatened everything she'd worked to build, including her relationship with Marcus and his family. The crisis reached its peak when Marcus's family started asking direct questions about why Jessica's mother wouldn't be at the wedding. They'd met me briefly at the engagement party, and Marcus's mother had been looking forward to getting to know me better during the wedding planning process. When Jessica kept making vague excuses about me being unavailable or dealing with personal issues, Marcus's family began to sense that something was seriously wrong. Marcus's father, who prided himself on family values and close relationships, became particularly concerned when he learned that Jessica had no contact with her only living parent. "What kind of family emergency lasts for 6 months?" he asked Marcus, according to what I learned through my network of former coworkers who still had connections to their social circle. And why wouldn't Jessica want to help her mother through whatever crisis she's facing? The questions forced Jessica into an impossible position. She couldn't tell Marcus's family the truth, that she'd been so embarrassed by me that she'd basically driven me away through years of dismissive treatment. That would expose her as the kind of person who abandons the mother who sacrificed everything for her success. But she also couldn't maintain the fiction that I was simply dealing with temporary personal problems, because the wedding was approaching and there was no sign of my return. Jessica's attempts to explain my absence became increasingly desperate and contradictory. She told Marcus's mother that I was dealing with health issues, told his father that I was traveling for work, and told Marcus himself that we'd had a minor disagreement that would be resolved soon. When these stories didn't align, Marcus's family started wondering what Jessica was hiding and why she seemed so uncomfortable discussing her own mother. The situation became even more complicated when Jessica realized she needed me for practical wedding planning purposes that she'd never anticipated. She discovered that I was the only person who had contact information for my side of the family, including distant relatives she'd never bothered to stay in touch with but who traditionally would be invited to family weddings. Without me, Jessica had no way to invite her own extended family to her wedding. She didn't know her cousins' married names or current addresses. She couldn't reach her great-aunts who'd always been part of family celebrations. She had no connection to the family friends who'd watched her grow up and would expect to celebrate her marriage. Her entire family network had been maintained through me, and without me she was essentially orphaned from her own heritage. Even more devastating was Jessica's realization that she had no family heirlooms or traditions to incorporate into her wedding. She'd never asked about my grandmother's wedding dress or jewelry. She didn't know what flowers had been carried by the women in our family, or what songs had been meaningful at our celebrations. She'd been so busy distancing herself from her background that she'd lost access to the very traditions that would have given her wedding personal meaning and historical continuity. Marcus's family, who placed great importance on tradition and family heritage, found Jessica's disconnection from her own family increasingly troubling. They'd assumed that Jessica would bring her own family traditions to blend with theirs, creating a wedding that honored both sides of their union. Instead, they discovered that Jessica seemed to have no family traditions at all, no stories to share, no relatives to include in their celebration. The emotional impact of my absence became apparent when Jessica tried to write her wedding vows. She'd planned to include references to the love and guidance that had shaped her into the woman Marcus had fallen in love with. But when she sat down to write, she realized that most of the love and guidance in her life had come from the mother she'd been too embarrassed to acknowledge. Every major achievement Jessica mentioned in her vows, her education, her career success, her confidence and independence, had been made possible by my sacrifices. But she couldn't mention those sacrifices without acknowledging me, and she couldn't acknowledge me because I was no longer accessible. Her wedding vows became a hollow recitation of her accomplishments without any recognition of their foundation. The crisis deepened when Marcus's family started planning the rehearsal dinner and realized they had no one from Jessica's side to include in the traditional family toasts and speeches. Marcus's father had prepared remarks about welcoming Jessica into their family, but they'd also planned for someone from Jessica's family to speak about her childhood, her character, and their hopes for her marriage. Without me, there was no one who could tell stories about Jessica's childhood, no one who'd witnessed her growth and development, no one who could speak with authority about the woman she'd become. The rehearsal dinner would be entirely dominated by Marcus's family, making Jessica look like someone with no family history or support system of her own. Jessica's desperation reached new heights when she realized that her wedding photos would document her isolation from her own family. There would be no mother-daughter getting ready photos, no shots of 3 generations of women celebrating together, no images of me proudly watching my daughter marry the man she loved. The visual record of her wedding would show a woman who appeared to have emerged from nowhere, with no family heritage to celebrate or honor. The breaking point came 2 weeks before the wedding when Marcus sat Jessica down for a serious conversation about my absence. He'd been patient and understanding, but his family's concerns had reached the point where they were questioning whether Jessica was emotionally healthy enough for marriage. A woman who could completely cut off her own mother without explanation was showing a capacity for coldness that worried them about her ability to maintain family relationships. "Jessica," Marcus said, according to what I learned through my support group connections, "my family is starting to wonder if you have some kind of personality disorder. Normal people don't just abandon their mothers without cause, especially not right before their wedding. If you can treat your own mother this way, what does that say about how you'll treat me if we have problems?" This conversation terrified Jessica because it threatened everything she'd worked to achieve. She'd spent years building an image of herself as a successful, sophisticated woman worthy of marrying into Marcus's established family. But her treatment of me was revealing character flaws that contradicted that carefully constructed image. She was being exposed as someone capable of callous abandonment of people who'd loved her unconditionally. Marcus demanded that Jessica either reconnect with me immediately or provide a legitimate explanation for our estrangement that his family could understand and accept. But Jessica couldn't do either. She couldn't find me because I'd deliberately made myself unreachable, and she couldn't explain our separation without admitting that she'd been ashamed of the mother who'd sacrificed everything for her success. When Jessica realized the thoroughness of my disappearance, she finally understood that this wasn't a temporary estrangement or a dramatic gesture designed to get her attention. I had genuinely and permanently removed myself from her life in response to her years of treating me like an embarrassment. The mother she'd taken for granted had made a calculated decision to give her exactly what she'd seemed to want, a life where I truly didn't exist. The wedding took place as scheduled, but it was a hollow celebration that highlighted Jessica's isolation rather than her happiness. She walked down the aisle alone, with no mother to escort her or witness her marriage. She had no family member to help her get dressed or hold her bouquet during the ceremony. The reception featured no speeches from her side of the family, no toasts celebrating her heritage, no relatives sharing stories about her childhood or character. Most painfully, there was no one to dance with Jessica during the traditional mother-daughter dance. The DJ had to skip that portion of the reception entirely, creating an awkward moment that highlighted my absence and left Jessica standing alone on the dance floor while other families celebrated together. The woman who'd pretended I didn't exist had gotten exactly what she'd seemed to want, a life where I genuinely didn't exist in her world. But instead of the freedom and sophistication she'd expected, she discovered that losing me meant losing her entire family history, her emotional foundation, and the unconditional love that had made her success possible in the first place. 3 years have passed since I disappeared from Jessica's life to show her what it truly meant when someone stopped existing for you. I never attended her wedding, never met her children when they were born, never provided the grandmotherly love and support that most families take for granted. My absence became a permanent fixture in her life, a constant reminder of what she'd lost when she chose embarrassment over gratitude. From what I learned through mutual acquaintances, Jessica's marriage struggled under the weight of questions that Marcus and his family never stopped asking. How could a normal person completely cut off their mother? What did Jessica's treatment of me suggest about her character and capacity for loyalty? These doubts created a foundation of distrust that no amount of explanation could fully address. Jessica tried various approaches to account for my absence. She told some people I'd died, but that lie fell apart when old friends mentioned seeing me in my new city. She told others that we'd had an irreconcilable falling out, but she could never provide details that made her look like the victim rather than the aggressor. Eventually, she settled on vague references to family complications that left everyone wondering what kind of daughter abandons her mother so completely. The practical consequences of my absence continued to compound over the years. When Jessica had children, she had no mother to call for advice about sleepless nights, feeding problems, or developmental concerns. She had no one who remembered her own childhood milestones to help her understand what was normal for babies and toddlers. She was navigating motherhood without the support system that most women depend on during that vulnerable time. More significantly, Jessica's children grew up with no maternal grandmother in their lives. They had no one to tell them stories about their mother's childhood, no one to provide the family history that helps children understand where they come from. Jessica couldn't tell those stories herself because she'd spent years trying to forget them, and I was no longer available to preserve and share that heritage. The emotional impact of my absence became particularly apparent during family celebrations and milestones. Jessica's children's birthdays, school performances, and achievements were celebrated only by Marcus's side of the family. There was no balance, no representation of Jessica's heritage, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices and love that had made Jessica's success possible. I built a completely new life in my new city, finally pursuing the education and interests I'd postponed while raising Jessica. I completed my business degree, started a small consulting company, and developed friendships with people who valued my experience and wisdom. For the first time since Jessica had left for college, I was living for myself rather than organizing my entire existence around someone else's needs and judgments. The women in my support group became like family to me, and we often discussed how our adult children had taken our sacrifices for granted until it was too late. Many of them had experienced similar rejection from children who'd become successful and decided their mothers were embarrassments to their new social status. We'd all learned the hard way that unconditional love doesn't guarantee respect or appreciation. I never attempted to contact Jessica or reconcile our relationship. She'd made it clear through years of behavior that she was ashamed of me, that my presence in her life was a liability rather than a blessing. I'd given her exactly what she'd seemed to want: complete freedom from the embarrassment of having a working-class mother who didn't naturally fit into her sophisticated new world. The irony, of course, was that my absence created far more problems for Jessica than my presence ever had. When I'd been available in the background, she'd been able to take my support for granted while maintaining her distance. Without me entirely, she discovered how much she depended on my availability, my knowledge, and my unconditional love. Through the years, I occasionally heard updates about Jessica's life from mutual acquaintances. Her marriage faced ongoing challenges, partly because Marcus's family never fully trusted her after witnessing her capacity for abandoning family members. Her children asked increasingly difficult questions about why they had no grandmother on their mother's side. Jessica struggled to maintain the facade of success while dealing with the emotional and practical void left by my absence. Sometimes I wondered if Jessica ever truly understood what she'd lost when she chose to pretend I didn't exist. Did she realize that in her quest to escape her humble beginnings, she discarded the very foundation that had made her success possible? Did she understand that the love and sacrifice she'd been so eager to hide were exactly the qualities that had shaped her into someone worthy of being loved? I kept one photo from our past, a picture of Jessica graduating from college, beaming with pride while I stood beside her in my best dress, tears of joy streaming down my face. In that photo, captured before she'd learned to be ashamed of me, Jessica looked genuinely happy to have me there celebrating her achievement. It reminded me that there had been a time when my daughter valued my love more than other people's opinions. The woman who'd raised Jessica with bleeding hands and an endless heart had learned to live without the daughter she'd sacrificed everything to create. And Jessica, who'd pretended I didn't exist because she thought I embarrassed her, had discovered what true embarrassment looked like, explaining to everyone in her life why she had no mother, no family history, no foundation of love to build upon. She'd wanted me to disappear so she could present herself as someone who'd emerged fully formed into her sophisticated adult life. Instead, my disappearance had revealed her as someone hollow, someone with no roots, someone capable of discarding the person who'd loved her most. The embarrassment she tried so hard to avoid had become the defining characteristic of her adult life, not because of who I was, but because of who she'd chosen to become when she decided I wasn't worth keeping. They thought they could pretend I didn't exist because I embarrassed them with my working-class background and genuine emotions. They had no idea they were about to lose the only person who'd ever loved them unconditionally, the only witness to their character development, the only source of their family history and heritage. When I finally made myself truly non-existent in their world, they learned the difference between being embarrassed by someone's presence and being haunted by their absence. And in that haunting emptiness where a mother's love used to live, they discovered what real shame felt like, not the imaginary shame of having an imperfect mother, but the genuine shame of being the kind of person who throws away unconditional love because it doesn't match their desired image.